Mr. Spencer has been studying Islamic theology, law, and history in depth since 1980. Mr. Spencer has been banned by the British government from entering the United Kingdom for the crime of pointing out that Islam has doctrines of violence against unbelievers. He has been boycotted by the US Conference of Catholic bishops for refusing to adhere to their Islam is a religion of peace line. And with this, I would like to welcome Mr. Robert Spencer to the podium, our guest speaker. If you could all give him a hand, please.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here. I understand that you watched some of Islam, What the West Needs to Know earlier this evening. Is that correct? And so I feel as if now standing before you that I've suddenly aged 15 years in 10 minutes. But that's the way it goes. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. It is a moment of some distraction for me, I have to confess, because my brother-in-law is ill. I was just talking with him earlier. He's having some psychological problems and he thinks he's a moth. And I was talking to him and I said, you really have to go to a doctor. And he said, I did. I went to a doctor today. And so I was thinking that we were out of the woods, and I said, that's great. What did he say? And he said, well, it was a dentist. And I said, you need a psychologist, you don't need a dentist. Why did you go to the dentist? And he said, his light was on. And the reality of the situation that we face tonight, my friends, is that my brother-in-law is the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the United States. In other words, people who believe in absolutely unreal things are in charge of the Western world today. You may remember Alice in Wonderland and the chess pieces that were alive, and there was the White Queen, and the White Queen told Alice, I can believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. And I think she's got nothing on Justin Trudeau and Barack Obama, who can believe 12, 15, or 20 impossible things before breakfast and several hundred more by dinner time. And the impossible things that they believe and the fantasies to which they have committed themselves would be laughable were it not for the fact that they are deforming our foreign and domestic policies in both Canada and the United States, and that similar fantasists are in charge in Great Britain, in France, in Germany, in Italy, all over the free world. And that this can only be a recipe for disaster if it is not turned around. Now specifically, the fantasies that they would have us believe, we're really all familiar with. We've heard them all many times before. One of the chief ones that we hear is that ISIS, the group that calls itself the Islamic State, is not Islamic and has nothing whatsoever to do with the religion of Islam. Have you ever heard that? Now, the reality is that ISIS, or ISIL as the President of the United States calls it, or the Islamic State as they call themselves, actually has everything to do with the religion of Islam. And this is not just a matter of looking into strange religious beliefs that we do not hold and have no particular interest in. This is a pressing matter of national security for Canada, for the United States, for Western Europe and Great Britain. Because it's very simple. It's an adage as old as warfare. You cannot defeat an enemy you do not understand. And we are in the position now, like my brother-in-law the moth, of replacing reality with fantasy and making that fantasy into public policy. What we have is the Islamic State saying, we are doing what we are doing because of the religion of Islam. We are the quintessential embodiment of the religion of Islam. We believe fully and wholeheartedly in the Quran, the Islamic holy book, and in the teachings of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. And we are implementing them in our country that we have carved out of Iraq and Syria. It's a territory larger than Great Britain, with 8 million people in it. And they say that they are the only rightful government in that area, and indeed in the whole world. And that that government is based wholly and entirely upon Islamic principles. And in response, Barack Obama, John Kerry, David Cameron, Justin Trudeau all say, no, you really don't have anything to do with Islam, and nothing that you're doing is Islamic at all. Now the reason why this dispute matters, as absurd as that is, that when the enemy tells you his ideology, we say, no, 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 you don't really believe that. But as absurd as that is, it becomes dangerous because it makes for misapprehensions of the problem that lead to the wrong solutions being applied. It's just like if you had a headache and you said, I will just take some aspirin and my headache will go away. And it actually turned out to be a brain tumor. The aspirin will not help. And if you continue to just take aspirin and say it's just a minor headache problem and it has nothing to do with anything more serious, then the brain tumor will kill you. We're in the same situation now. The longer we misapprehend this problem and the longer we keep our heads in the sand about it and deny what it's really all about, then the more we will not be able to deal with it adequately or properly, and the more lethal it will grow. Case in point is the Muslim migrant problem. The migrants flooding into Canada and the United States, and all of us know that anybody who opposes this mass migration is a racist and a bigot and a hate monger and an Islamophobe. And everybody knows that such people have no place in polite society. This migrant issue is inextricably bound up with that of ISIS or the Islamic State in ways that most of the mainstream media never discusses when they are dismissing opposition to the mass migration as just racism and xenophobia. The fact is that the migrants are overwhelmingly Muslim, and those Muslims are coming to Europe and Canada and the United States after the Islamic State threatened in February 2015 to flood Europe with 500,000 refugees. They said they were going to do it, and a few months later the refugees started to come. And once again, public policy analysts in Canada, the United States, and Europe all said, well, this migration is a humanitarian crisis out of Syria and has nothing to do with the Islamic State threatening to send 500,000 refugees into Europe. Now, wait a minute. Where is the Islamic State? Well, it's in Syria, as well as in Iraq. And so to say that it has nothing to do with their threat in the first place is silly. Even worse, most of the migrants, as many as 80%, are not Syrian at all. Where's the war right now? Syria. So if you're a refugee from a war zone, you would have to be Syrian. If you're not Syrian, if you're Moroccan or Algerian or something else, and most of the migrants are not Syrian, then you have a very different agenda from the agenda that is stated as you're a refugee from a war zone. So what are they really coming for? Well, to answer that question, we have to look into the religion of Islam, because the religion of Islam is actually what is guiding and motivating a great deal of this. But that's the one thing, you see, that all our learned analysts and all our political leaders have taken off the table. It has nothing to do with Islam. So they can't tell what it has to do with. They pretend it's a humanitarian crisis when there's amazing cognitive dissonance about that right away, you see. If they're not Syrians, if a great many of them are not Syrians, then what exact humanitarian crisis are they fleeing? So in order to understand what's going on, we have to go to the Quran. So if you'll open your Qurans to chapter 4. You didn't bring it? I never leave home without mine. Anyway, it's no problem. I did bring mine. So you go to chapter 4, verse 100. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It says, he who emigrates in the way of Allah will find in the earth enough room for refuge, plentiful resources, and he who goes forth from his house is a migrant in the way of Allah and his messenger, and whom death overtakes, his reward becomes incumbent upon Allah. Now, did you hear that? He who emigrates, if you leave your country and go to another country, in the way of Allah. Now that means you're not just emigrating to get a better job. You're not emigrating so that you can climb up the economic ladder and send money back to your family at home. You are emigrating in the way of Allah means you are emigrating in order to bring Islam to the new land. This is in imitation of Muhammad himself, who was the first emigrant. As a matter of fact, the beginning of Islam, according to the Islamic calendar, is not when Muhammad became a prophet, not when Muhammad was born, when Muhammad died, or anything we might expect. It's when Muhammad emigrated, the Hijrah, from Mecca to Medina, when he moved from one city to another in Arabia in order to become for the first time not just a spiritual leader and a preacher, but a political and military leader as well. He was bringing Islam to the new land and making it into a political entity. And that's the beginning of Islam, according to the Islamic calendar. And so, he who emigrates in the way of Allah is bringing Islam to the new place that he's coming to. And if he dies in the new land, his reward becomes incumbent upon Allah. Now that's very important. That means Allah, the Supreme God, has to reward him. He has to. He can't change his mind about this. It's binding. It's in the Quran. Now this is very important because in the Islamic scheme of things, if you're coming from a Christian background, you're used to thinking, well, Jesus died for my sins, he rose from the dead, and opened up heaven for me. Whereas in the Islamic scheme of things, there is no Savior and no redemption. There is only the scales. The scales are explained in chapter 21, verse 47 of the Quran. We shall set up just scales on the day of resurrection, so that none will be wronged in the least. Even if it be the weight of a grain of a mustard seed, we shall suffice as reckoners. What's a grain of mustard seed? Your good deeds. The idea is, if your good deeds, they go on one scale, your bad deeds go on the other. If your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you go to paradise. If your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, you go to hell. That's it. Now, if you think about this for a second, if you were a believing Muslim, that would drive you crazy. Because, how many good deeds have you committed? Do you know? How many bad deeds have you committed? Do you know? Do you know if you've committed more good deeds than bad deeds? Are you sure? Do you know how much your good deeds weigh? Do you know how much your bad deeds weigh? There's no way to know this. And so you're in danger of going to hell. And you might be on the way, but you can't be sure. And see, the thing is, hell is very lavishly described in the Quran. That Allah will pour molten lead down your throat for all eternity. He will burn off your skin and then issue you a new skin so he can burn that one off. It's a terrible place. You want to stay away from it. But you can't be sure with these scales which way you're going to go. However, you can do a couple of things to remedy your situation and make sure you're going to be okay. And one of the main ones is you can emigrate in the way of Allah. And then his reward is incumbent. He has to reward you. If you leave your home to bring Islam to a new land. So the Islamic State said, we're going to flood Europe with 500,000 refugees. They were talking about a several-pronged plan. One was to overwhelm the welfare apparatus in the European socialist states and to make them collapse. And that's working great. That's on its way. But also, they wanted to emigrate, to send people who were emigrating in the way of Allah. The Quran says also to the Muslims, you are the best of people, you're the best nation on earth. That's chapter 3, verse 110. Because you enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. See, Allah tells the Muslims, you're the best nation on earth because you know what's right and wrong, and they don't. And so when you emigrate in the way of Allah, what you're doing is you're bringing the system of right and wrong that's in the Quran and in Islam to the new land. And so you're coming with a model for society that you consider to be superior to the model for society in the land you're coming to, and you're determined to replace the one with the other. And so when you think about Islamic law, if you're familiar with Islamic law, You probably know about the amputation of the hand for theft, stoning for adultery, the death penalty for leaving Islam, changing to another religion, the death penalty for heresy or being the wrong kind of Muslim. It's a very strict draconian system, institutionalizing discrimination against women, institutionalizing discrimination against non-Muslims, denying a woman's right to inheritance, a woman's right to testify in court even, devaluing their testimony and their inheritance rights. Polygamy, which essentially reduces women to the status of commodities. And all these things are Islamic law that they consider to be the law of Allah, immutable, perfect, and unchangeable, and part of the law that makes them the best of people because they know what is right and what is wrong, that they are emigrating to the new land in order to bring to the new land and impose upon them. And this is all what the emigration is about. And of course, then there's the jihad aspect, that there are jihad terrorists among the refugees as well. We've already seen this. The Paris attackers who killed 130 people in Paris in November. 2 of the attackers had just come in to Europe as refugees in October. Just a month before, weeks before the attack, they came into Europe as refugees. They were planning, in other words. They didn't just decide once they got there, hey, let's kill some Parisians. They went to Europe determined to commit mass murder. And they went as refugees. The Lebanese education minister gave an interview in September, and he said there were as many as 20,000 active jihadis among the refugees in his country waiting to go to Europe. Now, as far as the jihad goes, that is an even stronger imperative within Islam. One time, the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, was asked, "Can you tell me a deed that is greater than jihad?" And Muhammad said, "I cannot think of such a deed." So think about that, in light of all that we've been discussing so far. Your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you go to paradise. Your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, you go to hell. So, what's the best deed of all? Jihad. What is jihad? Jihad means struggle in Arabic, but the primary struggle in Islamic theology is warfare against unbelievers, to subjugate them and bring them into the rule of Islamic law. So that's the best deed of all. That's the best thing you can do. So that makes sure you go straight to paradise. It outweighs everything else. Not only that, the Quran also says this. We've been talking about paradise and hell and how you can get to one and to keep out of the other. And we saw that emigration is a very fine thing you can do. And Allah has to reward you if you do it. And even greater than that is jihad, the greatest deed of all. And then we see in chapter 9, verse 111 of the Quran, surely Allah has purchased of the believers their lives and their property, and in return has promised that they shall have paradise. Why has He promised? He's promised now that they shall have paradise. But for what? They fight in the way of Allah, and that word is jihad, struggle. They fight in the way of Allah, and they kill and are killed. So if you kill and are killed for Allah, then you're guaranteed paradise. Do not pass go, do not collect $200, you go straight in. No problem. And this is the suicide bombing imperative, you see. This is why we see people go and they strap bombs to themselves and they go and blow themselves up in a crowd of infidels. Because they know that if they kill and are killed for Allah, then paradise is promised to them. It's not negotiable. It's not just a reward is incumbent upon Allah, but even greater than that, paradise is promised to them. And so we saw the refugees, the 2 guys that came into Europe in October, they made their way to France, and they went in and they killed 130 people in Paris, and several of them were killed. They knew that they wanted to be killed because if they were killed in the process of killing infidels, then paradise would be guaranteed to them. Now, this is what the emigration is all about. Even if you do not have Muslims who are ever going to kill and be killed for Allah. And even if you have people who are coming over here with no intention of waging jihad, you still have a major problem because of the idea that Muslims are the best of people, and conversely, the Quran also says that unbelievers, the unbelievers of the people of the book, the Quran calls Jews and Christians people of the book because they received revelations from Allah, although the Quran also says that they twisted them and aren't obeying them. But they received revelations from Allah. And the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, the believers among the people of the book become Muslims because they recognize that Muhammad is another prophet. But the unbelievers among the people of the book, that is Jews and Christians who remain Jews and Christians, it says they're the most vile of created beings. This is chapter 98, verse 6 of the Quran. So, you've got the best of people on the one hand and the most vile of created beings on the other. The best of people enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. And the most vile of created beings, obviously, their judgment is not quite so great. So, when it comes to how society is going to be constituted, how we are going to be governed, we have Canadian society, which has, or at least had up to recently, the freedom of speech, and has guaranteed the equality of rights of women and the equality of rights of all people before the law. But you have a group of people coming in, a large number of whom, everybody is an individual, and there are many, many Muslims, I'm sure, who are coming in who just don't care about any of this. But the ones who care about it are a matter of concern, because they believe that they are the best of people, who enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, and that they are determined to impose a system of society and governance that denies the freedom of speech and denies the freedom of conscience. It has a death penalty for leaving Islam, denies the equality of rights of women, denies the equality of rights of non-Muslims. The equality of rights of non-Muslims is another thing. ISIS, the Islamic State, is notorious for, among other things, when they came into Christian areas in Iraq. Mosul, the city of Mosul in Iraq, was a Christian city since practically the beginning of Christianity. And there were Christian areas all over Iraq, a sizable Christian population that has been completely decimated. And one of the things that the Islamic State did was they went around, and when they found homes of the Christians, they painted the Arabic letter Nun, which looks like that, kind of like a bowl with a dot on top, and they painted it on the doors of the Christians. That is the letter N for Nazarenes, which is the Quran's word for the Christians. And they were marking the Christians' homes because later they came to those homes and they knocked on the door and they said, you have to pay us a tax as a sign of your subordination. Now this also comes from the Quran. The Quran says, fight, this is chapter 9, verse 29, fight against those who do not believe in Allah and the last day, and do not forbid what He has forbidden of the religion of truth, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya, that's the tax, with willing submission, and feel themselves subdued. Historically, when these laws were enforced in Islamic lands, the Jews and Christians lived in that state of subordination, designed to punish them every day, to make them realize that they were being deprived in this world, punished in this world, for rejecting the true prophet and the true holy book. And these laws were abolished in the last caliphate, the last Islamic empire, in the 1850s, under Western pressure. But they're in the Quran, and the Islamic State is enforcing them again. And the idea is that a Christian in Iraq, under these laws, would not be able to hold authority over a Muslim, would be relegated then to the most menial jobs in society, would not be able to build new houses of worship or repair old ones. So the community would be in a state of decline, would have to pay this tax, and submit to various other humiliating and discriminatory regulations. The Islamic State came in and began to enforce that upon the Christians. The remaining Christians, who they have not killed or forced to convert or exiled, are paying this tax and living in a state of subordination to the Muslims. Now you see, this is diametrically opposed to the Western idea of equality of rights of all people before the law, and no special rights for special protected groups. And so when you have a large number of immigrants coming to the country who believe in these things, there's going to be friction about it, because there will be attempts to assert the primacy of that law over the existing laws. Everything that the Islamic State does, we've seen now with the persecution of the Christians. Also notorious that the Islamic State has done is take the women of the Yazidis and the Christians as sex slaves. And this is a very unpleasant topic, and you think, you know, this couldn't be happening. This is the 21st century, and yet they do it. And this also is based on the Quran. The Quran says in chapter 4, verse 3, marry the women that seem good to you, 2 or 3 or 4. Or, if you fear you will not be able to treat them justly, then only 1, or from those your right hands possess. Now, I have this Quran, there are copies of it in hardcover back there that are not beat up like this, but this is a very good Quran. The translation is actually not all that hot, but the commentary is by Sayyid Abu Ala Maududi, who was a 20th century Islamic scholar and politician. His works are internationally influential. I tell you, next time you go to your local Islamic bookstore, ask them for Maududi's writings, and I guarantee that you will find them in there, because he's very mainstream. And so his commentary, it's illuminating of the mainstream Muslim mindset about these passages. He says, what is the captives of the right hand? He says, this expression denotes slave girls, that is, female captives of war, who are distributed by the state among individuals when no exchange of prisoners takes place. Now, does that not sound exactly like what the Islamic State did? And it's very clear what they are for in other passages, notably chapter 23, verses 1 to 6. If you want to turn over there, we have, the believers have indeed attained true success. Those who in their prayers humble themselves, who avoid whatever is vain and frivolous, who observe zakah, that's almsgiving, giving money to the poor, who strictly guard their private parts, except from their wives or those whom their right hands possess. So that makes it clear what those whom their right hands possess are for. Now, it's very important to understand that everything ISIS is doing is Islamic, because Barack Obama, Justin Trudeau, David Cameron, all the rest of them would have us believe that the problem is isolated to this group, to these extremists who have hijacked and twisted the peaceful religion of Islam. And that would give us the impression then that if we were to defeat ISIS, which nobody is really trying very hard to do, but if we were to get it together and actually defeat them, then this problem would go away. But we must understand that if the problem is in this book and in the religion itself, then it's not going to go away with ISIS. Anybody who reads this book and takes it seriously could end up acting upon it in the same way. It doesn't mean that everyone who does read this book will act upon it, but the possibility cannot be discounted and ought not to be ignored, especially by those who are entrusted with the protection of our society. There was a young man a few years back in North Carolina, at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, who he was a Muslim by birth, by descent, by his family, but he was not at all observant in Islam. He didn't pay any attention to it. He was a college kid, and he was drinking, he was getting high, he was sleeping around. He was, you know, a college kid. And his name was Mohammed Reza Tahiri Azar. And one day, Mohammed Reza Tahiri Azar decided that he was really making a mess of his life. As you may recall the line from the movie, you know, son, fat, drunk, and stupid is a terrible way to go through life. And he decided that about himself. And so he turned to the only frame of reference that he had for turning his life around, his own religion, which he knew nothing about. And he got himself a Quran. And he started to read it. He wasn't part of Al-Qaeda. He wasn't part of ISIS, which didn't exist yet. He didn't have anything to do with any other Muslims. He just read the Quran. And he started to take notes. And this is why we know about this, because ultimately he sent all his notes to the campus paper. But that was a little bit later. What he read in the Quran were passages such as some of the ones I've told you tonight and some others. And he realized that one of the greatest things he could do was to try to kill unbelievers. And that he had committed a lot of sins in his life, and one way he could make sure the scales, the good scale outweighed the bad scale, was to kill and be killed for Allah. So he rented an SUV, and he drove it on campus. And he tried to run down as many students as he could. He didn't end up killing anybody, but he did injure 9 students before he was stopped. And then when he went to prison, these letters were released. And he had, for example, chapter 9, verse 14, was one of the many Quran verses that he cited. In chapter 9, verse 14, says, "Fight them, and Allah will punish them through you, and will humiliate them. He will grant you victory over them, and will soothe the hearts of those who believe." So see, his heart was troubled by all his sins, and he read, how can I soothe my heart? I can make war on unbelievers. And when I make war on unbelievers, Allah is punishing them through me. Fight them, and Allah will punish them through you, and will humiliate them. And so, he believed that he was an instrument of the Supreme Being, bringing about the wrath on the disobedient, the wrath of Allah on the disobedient. Now, how are our governments dealing with these kinds of young men? He was not connected to anybody, he was not radicalized, he just read the Quran. Just the other day, there was a story about a 16-year-old boy in Australia, a Muslim, who got involved in a plot to commit mass murder on Anzac Day, the day that they celebrate their victory in World War II. And it came out that he was in a de-radicalization program. Now, a de-radicalization program, I'm sure you have them here. The United States government is spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on them in the United States. And the idea is to take these young men, like Mohammed Reza Tahiri Azhar, this young man in North Carolina, and others like him, and make them turn away from jihad. And so I read about this young guy in Australia and the de-radicalization program that he was in. Do you know what they had him doing? They gave him a free gym membership. Now, can you imagine? If you think about this, fight them, and Allah will punish them through your hands, and humiliate them, and soothe the hearts of the believers. You read that and you think, I'm going to be part of this grand thing, this great enterprise, this huge initiative to bring the law of Allah to the world, to punish the unbelievers. And they say, here kid, here's a basketball. Forget about all that. And it's true. In Minnesota, it's the same thing. It's a big problem in the Minneapolis area. Muslims from Somalia going to join the Islamic State because they see that it is Islamic. They see that what it's doing is based on Islam. And so they join it because also the Islamic State claims to be the caliphate, which in Islamic theology for Sunni Muslims, which is most Muslims, is the only legitimate government for any Muslim worldwide. And so they see that, they heed that call, they believe it, and they've been going over there. And so in response, because the United States government refuses to believe that any of this has anything to do with Islam, they have started youth basketball programs in Minneapolis that are government funded. And the idea is to give these poor disenfranchised youth something to do. And that will keep them from jihad. Now you see, if you unpack this, the idea is that they think these people are poor and discriminated against, and disenfranchised and alienated. And so if we get them jobs, and we get them something to do with their time, then they won't go jihad. Now you see the massive disconnect there. This is a spiritual thing. This is a spiritual battle. These people believe they are serving God. There's a passage, whether you're a Christian or not, it's very interesting that there's a passage in the Gospel of John when Jesus says, the time will come when men will kill you and think they're offering service to God. And that describes these people perfectly. They kill us, and they think they're, in doing so, offering service to God. They're not going to be dissuaded by a basketball. But it's all because our governments refuse to accept what is the obvious ideology and the obvious motivation behind all this. And the quintessential example of this myopia is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Have you ever noticed that however old any of us are in this room, and I'm probably one of the oldest people here, however old we may be, any of us, this problem, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, has been going on all our lifetimes. And it's been solved so many times. You remember Jimmy Carter standing with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, and they're all smiles and they're shaking hands, and there's going to be peace now. And then, well, that didn't work, and so there were the Oslo Accords, and there was the roadmap, and there was the withdrawal from Gaza, and none of it ever worked. And it is still one of the massive problems in the world today. Why is that? Why is this problem insoluble? You would think that all the negotiated accords, all the attempts at a negotiated settlement would have come to something by now. There are negotiated settlements that have ended wars all over the world, all throughout history. Used to be, you may recall, back in the 70s, we used to hear about violence in Ireland all the time. In Northern Ireland, with the IRA. You never hear about that now. Why? They negotiated a settlement. It's over. Why, after 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 negotiated settlements between Israel and the Palestinians, it never ends? Why is that? Well, it happens that the answer is in the Quran. You have one side, the Palestinians, believing that this is the perfect word of Allah, perfectly delivered to Muhammad by means of the angel Gabriel from Allah. It's the eternal book that has existed forever with Allah in paradise. There are 3 eternal things in Islam. Allah, His throne, and His book. And He gave the book to Muhammad. This is it. Or the Arabic of it is. So, Quran in chapter 2, verse 191, it says, "Drive them out from where they drove you out." Now, that's a simple phrase. If you're just reading along in the Quran for fun, it might fly right by you. But it's very important. Drive them out from where they drove you out. What does that mean? It means that in Islamic theology, any land that belonged to Muslims, that was ruled by Muslims at any time, belongs by right to the Muslims forever. Because the Muslims have a responsibility before Allah, a command of God, to drive out those who drove them out. And of course, in 1948, when the State of Israel was declared, the Arab states around it immediately declared war on Israel. And they were confident that within weeks they would destroy the Jewish state, and that would be the end of it. They even called upon Muslim Arabs in Israeli lands to leave. Because they said, it's going to be bloody, it's going to be a war zone, get out now, and in a few weeks when we destroy Israel, you can come back home. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. But in the Islamic version, or the mainstream media version, which is identical, you will hear people say, the Israelis drove the Muslim Arabs out of the land. They forced them to leave. As a matter of fact, the Israelis were inviting the Muslim Arabs to stay and build a pluralistic society with them together. But they left. And so, the Quran says, drive them out from where they drove you out. They have that as a command. They have to do it. And there's more. It's not just that it's Muslim land. It's who is running it. The Quran says in chapter 2, verse 89, that this is about the Jews. Even though there has come to them a book from Allah. See, in the Islamic scheme of things, the Jews have the Torah, which is a book from Allah, which they then changed the text of. But they have that. And then they reject the Quran when it comes to them, even though it confirms the teachings of the book that they have, the Torah. Now there has come to them a book from Allah, and how are they treating it? Even though it confirms the truth already in their possession, and even though they had prayed for victory against the unbelievers. Yet when that book came to them, and they recognized it. See, the Jews know that the Quran is true, but they refuse to believe it, or refuse to accept it, refuse to admit it. So they're already perverse, they're already lying. They refuse to acknowledge its truth. Allah's curse be upon the unbelievers. Evil indeed is what they console themselves with. So Allah's curse is upon them. And then in 3:112, it says, wherever they are, wherever they were covered with ignominy, except when they were protected by either a covenant with Allah, that is, if they submitted and they became dhimmis under that protected status that I described before, where they hold only menial jobs and can't hold authority over Muslims and have to pay the tax and everything else. They are laden with the burden of Allah's wrath, and humiliation has been pitched upon them. All this because they rejected the signs of Allah and killed the prophets without right, and because they wantonly disobeyed and transgressed. And so you have, this is about the Jews, that they killed the prophets, they wantonly disobeyed Allah, they transgressed, and they are laden with the burden of Allah's wrath, they're under His curse, and humiliation has been pitched upon them. And remember that other verse that the young man in Chapel Hill read, Muhammad Reza Tahiri Azhar. Fight them, and Allah will punish them through you and humiliate them. And then this one says that the Jews are humiliated. Humiliation has been pitched upon them. So that also, you see, is a responsibility of the Muslims. They have to make sure to humiliate the Jews, because humiliation has been pitched upon them. If the Jews are not humiliated, then Muslims have the responsibility to fight them, and Allah will punish them through the Muslims and humiliate them. So they have a responsibility before God to humiliate the Jews, and not certainly to live in a state that's ruled by Jews. Now, if you consider all this, if you have a believer who really thinks this is the eternal word of Allah, the one and only God, and then you see the state of Israel, what are you going to think of it? Are you going to think, we need to come to a negotiated settlement with these people and live in peace and harmony with them? Do you think that we just need to find a solution that will please everybody? A two-state solution, and we'll live in peace and harmony, which is what Obama and every other Western leader always says that they're working toward. Two states living side by side in peace and mutual respect. Now, if you see these people who are enemies of Allah, humiliated and disgraced and accursed by Him, are you going to want to live next door to them as neighbors, as equals? And there's plenty more. In the Quran, in 3 places, Allah transforms the disobedient Jews into apes and pigs. And you see this in the jihadi rhetoric all the time. That you see in Palestinian TV, them saying, these children of apes and pigs, we're going to drive them from the land. These things are religious imperatives. There will never be peace between Israel and Palestinians because of the Quran's hatred of the Jews. And the idea that the Jews are indeed the worst enemies of the Muslims. Chapter 5, verse 82. Of all people, you will find the Jews and those who associate others with Allah and His divinity, that is, polytheists, to be the most hostile to those who believe. So the Jews are among those who are the most hostile to those who believe. Are you going to want to live next door? It's never going to happen. So what we need to do in response to all this is, in the first place, recognize it. It's an unpleasant thing. I understand that. These truths are unwelcome to a tremendous degree in society today because they're so unpleasant. Because people want to think, well, it can't really be that bad. You must be just putting a bad face on it. It must be really, it can't be as bad as you say. And surely we can sit down with these folks and reason with them and come to some agreement. Unfortunately, the religious imperative is something that I think that is very misunderstood in Washington, in Ottawa, in London, all over the West. Western, postmodern, secularist types, post-Christian for the most part, the people who lead us, they don't understand how strong the religious motivation can be, how absolutely defining of for one's life it can be if you think that you are serving God and on the right track. And so they completely underestimate it, they devalue it, and as a result they've gotten us into all this mess because of all these wrong-headed policies. What we need to do is, in the first place, recover our strength. The jihad manuals say, do not fight jihad if the enemy has more than twice your strength and you have no chance of winning. And it's certainly true that when the West had more cultural confidence, as well as military might, we didn't see all this jihad all over. They're fighting us now because we're weak. If we were strong, they wouldn't be fighting us so much. We need to stop the suicidal policies in terms of the migration and in terms of many other aspects of our foreign policy. It came out yesterday that the Pakistani spy service, the CIA of Pakistan, the ISI, they were sheltering Osama bin Laden. It's not just that they knew he was there, they were taking care of him. They were controlling his well-being. They knew where he was, they were making sure he was okay. This is supposed to be an ally of Canada and the United States. This is a country that George W. Bush met with Parvez Musharraf, the president of Pakistan, right after 9/11, and he agreed to give him $1.3 billion a year to fight against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. In 2008, it came out that much of that money was being funneled by the Pakistani government to al-Qaeda and the Taliban. What do you think the US Congress did when this came out? Did they cut off the $1.3 billion to Pakistan every year? They increased it. This is, of course, the madness that we live in the world today. But see, this too comes from the Quran. In chapter 3, verse 28, it says, do not take unbelievers for your friends and protectors in preference to believers. Whoever does this has nothing to do with Allah, unless he does so in order to protect himself from their wrongdoing. Now what does that mean? Unless he does so in order to protect themselves from their wrongdoing. Well, let's go to the note and see what Maududi says. This means, he says, that it is lawful for a believer, helpless in the grip of the enemies of Islam and in imminent danger of severe wrong and persecution, to keep his faith concealed and to behave in such manner as to create the impression that he is on the same side as his enemies. Does that sound like the government of Pakistan to you? It does to me. But of course in Washington they would say, oh no, 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 you can't really believe that the Pakistanis would be lying to us. You must be a racist, bigoted Islamophobe. And there we are. But see, if we had a recognition of the real ideological sources of this problem, then we would reconfigure our global alliances in the West. The alliances that Canada and the United States have today are still based on the Cold War, are based on fighting the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is gone. There's no need to consider Pakistan as an ally, and there's in no way behaving as one. Meanwhile, India is a state that is threatened by jihad activity as much as Canada and the US are. And there are many other countries that are threatened by jihad activity in a direct way. We should be reconfiguring our alliances globally so that we are allied with people who are facing the same threat. And instead of forcing the Israelis to make more concessions, which only create more jihad because they give the impression of weakness, we should be helping Israel to stand strong and telling them there's no more land for peace because all the land we've given you has never brought peace. You may recall, 10 years ago, we were told that when the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, there would be peace, and the Gazans would go about their business and resume normal lives. And instead, they turned Gaza into a jihad base, as could have been predictable if anybody had been reading the Quran. And so, the situation is difficult. The situation is, you could even say, dire. And there's no sugarcoating that. And I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I firmly believe that we have to know where we are in a realistic manner, as bad as the news is, if we're going to be able to get out of it. And we are being lied to on a massive scale by our governments, such that we're being led into disaster. The situation is grave, but it's not irreversible. I was born in the great state of South Carolina. I know I probably would not seem to you like an ordinary South Carolinian if you've ever met one. But in any case, the state motto of South Carolina is Dum Spiro Spero, in Latin, while I breathe, I hope. And it's certainly true that we are poised for victory in this, as bleak as things seem, because we have the truth on our side. And Justin Trudeau and Barack Obama and David Cameron and all the rest of them, they have to keep billowing out these fantasies and lies. And they keep having to bombard us with this nonsense about Islam being a religion of peace and all the rest of it. And they have to keep insisting on it because it's so howlingly false and so obviously false. And they're doing what Joseph Goebbels taught, that you repeat the big lie over and over and people will start believing it. But they have to keep repeating it over and over because the evidence of our senses so abundantly refutes them all the time. All we have to do is stand for the truth, but we have to stand. There is no one else who's going to do it for us. This is a war. It's not a war with weapons. It's not a war with guns and bombs, although there is that aspect of it. But it's primarily a spiritual and ideological war, and we are the soldiers of it. There is nobody who is going to fight it for us. And so in closing, I encourage you all, in wherever you are in life, and whatever you do, that you consider becoming much more active in this struggle. That this is a struggle for our survival, for our freedoms, for our children's future. And it's up to us to alert our neighbors and our friends to the nature and magnitude of what we're really facing, to pierce through the lies as much as we possibly can, to fight the fog of misinformation and disinformation, above all to call upon our political leaders to stop the nonsense and to deal realistically with these problems, and to insist that they do so or we'll get other ones. And the more of us do that, the more likely we have a chance of success. And I'm confident ultimately of victory because the jihadis always boast, we will win because we love death more than you love life. And I know that when they say that, they're admitting defeat. Because death will never conquer life. And the imperative to live will always win out in the human spirit. It may get a lot worse before it gets better, but freedom and humane values will ultimately win out. And I hope that by the efforts of everybody in this room, we will see that victory in our lifetimes. Thank you. So you have questions, comments, death fatwas, whatever? I don't think we need that mic. No,
Q&A. You got a question over there, another one here. Which one do you want to take first, Rob?
The Yankee fan.
Okay, we've already established that Islam is a very, very primitive religion, right? But why do you still assume that, like, I'm sure even like Obama, Bush, and all these leaders, they must know, or somebody behind them knows, that Islam is very primitive, or that it's a false religion, or whatever it is. But don't you think it's deliberately being done? Don't you think this, that they're deliberately lying to us? Like,
yeah.
Now if you look at the progressive left, they're telling that men could go into women's washrooms. It's getting so asinine.
Yeah.
Right? So
I didn't mean to give you the impression that I didn't think it was that I didn't think it was deliberate. I do think it's deliberate.
So then, do you think there's like a government behind them?
Yes. I don't know what's behind them. I don't want to get into speculation and conspiracy theories, but I do know this. Obama is a Marxist internationalist. I do believe Trudeau is as well.
Yes.
And what does that mean in practical terms is, I think, summed up by the fact that during the 2008 campaign, Obama was seen avidly reading a book called The Post-American World by Fareed Zakaria. And The Post-American World says essentially this, that the problem in the world is that America is a superpower, and there's only one. And if America were no longer a superpower, but were drastically weakened politically, militarily, and economically, then it would be more like the rest of the world, and there would be peace and harmony. And I believe that's the agenda that Obama has generally followed during his presidency, to weaken America politically, militarily, and economically so that the whole world is pretty much the same, which is the socialist imperative. And that part of that agenda is to have massive Muslim migration into the West and to exploit that migration, not to bring jihadis here, although they know that that's going to happen and they don't care, but in order to make Canada and make the United States into just exactly the kind of place that Jakarta was when Barack Obama was growing up there, and other cities in the third world, and to thereby level the distinctions between human beings. And you know, of course, anybody who opposes this is charged with racism, and this is not a racial issue, it's an ideological issue.
But they're deliberately
Yes.
dehumanizing the West.
Yeah,
They're deliberately doing it.
I think so.
Angela Merkel in 2010 said that multiculturalism was a failure.
Yeah.
Now she's bringing almost 1 million Muslims.
Yeah, they must have taken her in and given her a talk, you know.
Do you think that
Another question? Right here.
First of all, thank you.
Thank you.
For coming here. I know that in the States they have Islam Training Center conclaves. I'm wondering if you know of any in Canada.
Are you talking about the rural compounds?
Yes.
Yes, the question is there Islamic Training Center conclaves in the States. These are Muslims of America, generally. It's a group that is connected with Jamaat al-Fuqra in Pakistan. Jamaat al-Fuqra, you may know, is the organization that killed Daniel Pearl. Daniel Pearl was the Wall Street Journal reporter. He was actually going over to Pakistan to interview Sheikh Mubarak al-Jalani. And they're here. He was going to interview Sheikh Mubarak al-Jalani, the head of Jamaat al-Fuqra, when they actually captured and beheaded him. I guess they really didn't want the interview. Anyway, the Jamaat al-Fuqra group has this American wing, Muslims of America, and they have these compounds in very rural areas, very, very remote areas, far away from everything. They are very secretive, they are very closed off. People have heard them doing weapons training inside. They sometimes, even the local police are afraid to go in. And there have been very strange incidents. People strongly suspect that these are training camps for jihadis and that ultimately the jihadis will emerge from them. That has not yet happened. It could well. I don't know of any in Canada, but that's not to say that there aren't any, because there's this kind of activity trying to be going, there's this activity going on all the time. You may know Abu Hamza, Sheikh Abu Hamza al-Masri. He was an imam, a Muslim cleric in London. And he, in an excess of religious fervor, was building a bomb, and it went off while he was working on it. And he lost his hands. He has 2 hooks for hands, and he lost an eye. He's a very fearsome-looking character. He actually was at the Finsbury Park Mosque, which is where I got this Quran. I was in London in 2009, and I was doing what any American tourist would do in London. I was going to the local mosques. And at the Finsbury Park Mosque, which is where Abu Hamza al-Masri was the imam, I got this Quran. A very nice young man brought me in, saw me as a potential convert, weighed me down with books on Islam, one of whom was this. And I said, I hear you had some trouble here a few years back. And he said, yes, we had extremists here, but now they're gone and we're all moderates. So you can be sure this is the moderate Quran right here. Anyway, Abu Hamza al-Masri is now in prison in the United States for trying to establish an al-Qaeda training camp in Oregon. And so I can't be sure to say they've caught all these things. As a matter of fact, I think it's very likely that authorities have not, because after all, if they see a group of Muslims going into a rural area and start doing rifle training, they would probably think, oh, how nice. And so, why not? There's nothing stopping it. But I don't have any information on where they may be.
Okay, another question.
Right here.
Have you heard of the Islam movement? If so, could you elaborate?
Yes, I have heard of the Islam movement. It's a very dangerous movement, and it's far more widespread than people think. Chrislam is a term that has been popularized to refer generally to efforts to bring Muslims and Christians together in dialogue. And the dialogue is supposed to foster mutual understanding. And this dialogue actually is going on at the highest levels, and it is very insidious. It's far more insidious than people know. People think, now how could this be wrong? How could this be a problem? We're sitting down and talking and trying to work through our differences. How can you say, you greasy racist Islamophobe, that there's anything wrong with that? Well, I'll tell you. A few years back, Pope Benedict XVI, you may recall, he got Muslims around the world extraordinarily angry with him when he quoted the 14th century Byzantine emperor, Manuel II Palaiologos. And Manuel II Palaiologos had said, "There is nothing new in what Muhammad brought, except what is evil and inhumane." And Benedict quoted this in a speech in Germany in 2006. And Muslims around the world began to riot. A lot of innocent people were killed. And Benedict was dismayed. He said he didn't mean the words himself. He was just quoting. He backed off entirely. And after that, 100 Muslim scholars from around the world, some of the top Muslim scholars in the world, wrote a letter to him and to all the other major Christian leaders around the world. And it was called, the letter was called A Common Word. And it had an epigraph. The epigraph was a quote from the Quran, chapter 3, verse 64. "Say, people of the book, come to a common word between us and you." Now isn't that nice? And that's what it said at the top of this document. And the document was calling for this dialogue. And what could be wrong? We'll come to a common word. Now, the international press was thrilled, and dialogue was begun, and even to this day, you can look it up online, there is the Common Word Dialogue Initiative between Muslims and Christians. And they issue all these statements all the time, and they get together, and they talk things out, and issue more statements. I don't think anybody on the Christian side ever looked up where that epigraph from the Quran came from. Say, people of the book, let us come to a common word between us and you. Because if they had, they could have read on. Let us come to a common word between us and you, that we shall serve none but Allah, and shall associate none with him in his divinity. Now, associating another with Allah in his divinity is a very bad thing in Islam. As a matter of fact, it's worse than anything. It's worse than murder, worse than rape, anything. To pray to somebody else as well as to God. To associate others with Allah and his divinity. When Christians say Jesus is the Son of God and the second person of the Trinity, according to Islam, they are associating others with Allah in his divinity, and that's the worst sin of all. So what this passage is actually saying is, hey, let's come to a common word between us and you, that you will cut out all that and become Muslims. And that you'll stop praying to Jesus Christ and stop saying he's the Son of God and become Muslims. So that's what the initiative is all about. That's what the dialogue is all about, to convert the Christians to Islam. But the Christians, because they don't know, and they're being nice, they go into this dialogue. Now the insidious part of it is that as a result of this dialogue going on, the Catholic Church in the United States in particular is moving systematically to silence any criticism of Islam and any criticism of the Muslim persecution of Christians that has displaced well over 1 million Christians from their homes and killed tens of thousands in the Middle East. I was actually slated to speak in Massachusetts a few years back at a conference, a Catholic men's conference, and I was supposed to speak about this Muslim persecution of Christians. And at the last minute, the bishop of the area put the kibosh on my speaking, and he said, Spencer cannot come because talk about what the extremists do will harm the wonderful dialogue that we're having with Muslims in Massachusetts. A few months after that, a couple of those wonderful Muslims in Massachusetts blew up the Boston Marathon. And that is just one indication of how wonderful this dialogue was proceeding. But the fact is, this dialogue, while they're silencing people who speak out about what's really going on, this dialogue has not saved one Christian from being persecuted in the Middle East. It's not saved one church from being destroyed. It hasn't accomplished a single thing except make those people who are participating in it feel good and important. So in other words, it's compromised the church and made the Christians endangered in the Middle East even more than they were already, because nobody is speaking out for them. Nobody dares, because it'll harm our dialogue. It's not doing a thing. And it's emboldening this imperative on the part of the Muslims to try to just convert Christians to Islam. So it's a disaster in every possible way.
Next question over here.
Okay?
Can you, if anything, explain how the UN is connected to the jihad and how it is?
Can I explain how the UN is connected to the jihad? Yes, the UN is a foremost exponent of the jihad. I just splashed water on my glasses and now I can't see any of you, so I hope you're still here. But anyway, I hear you, so I know you must be around. The UN actually is an arm of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation at this point. It used to be that the UN was an arm of the Soviet bloc. But, of course, the Soviet bloc collapsed in the early 90s. Since then, the largest single voting bloc at the UN is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is 56 Muslim governments and the Palestinian Authority. 57 votes immediately for any Islamic imperative that is ever proposed. Thank you so much. Thank you. Wow. Oh, you're back. Thank you. So, that 57 nation bloc, 57 vote bloc, can do whatever it wants. There's no bigger bloc opposing it. And many times they can establish alliances with other groups. And so they persecute Israel constantly. And they say that they constantly are condemning Israel for various fictional human rights abuses and ignoring countries that actually have human rights abuses. Saudi Arabia is on the Human Rights Council. And Saudi Arabia institutes Islamic law based on the Quran, dehumanizing women, stoning people to death, beheading people, amputating the hands of thieves, and they're on the Human Rights Commission and Israel is condemned. It's a ridiculous situation, but the UN is essentially, because it's just a servant of the OIC at this point, it is aiding and abetting the advance of the global jihad.
Right here.
Yes, sir.
Sharia court has been established now in the EU for a few years, anyways. Have you heard of any Sharia courts established in Canada or the United States?
Have I heard of any Sharia courts established in Canada or the United States? I haven't heard of any in Canada, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any. I apologize, but I am American and concentrate primarily on America, although I do keep track of world news about jihad. Many of the smaller stories that are elsewhere I do miss. So there may be Sharia courts in Canada. I wouldn't be in the least surprised if there were, because there was one established recently in Texas, and there are a great many in Great Britain. Great Britain is kind of a test case for these Sharia courts. And I'm quite certain, I can tell you with 100% certainty, sir, that if there are no Sharia courts in Canada now, there will be soon. Sharia courts are, we are told, just like courts for Jewish law or for Catholic canon law. They are about private matters, marital issues, things like that. They're voluntary, and they do not conflict with the civil law, the criminal law, etc. The British people were promised that if Sharia courts were established in Britain, that they would not conflict with the criminal courts, and that any matter referring to criminal activity would be referred from the Sharia courts to the criminal courts. This was not the case. The Quran says, good women are obedient. As for those who are not, as for those from whom you fear disobedience, actually it says, not even those who are disobedient, but those from whom you fear disobedience, give them a warning, that's step 1. Send them to separate bed, that's step 2. Step 3, beat them. Beat them. So spousal abuse is universal, of course, but only in Islam does it have divine sanction. And so this is where the Sharia courts and the criminal courts are in conflict. Because in Britain, this is what happened. A woman would come into the Sharia courts and say, my husband's beating me. What they should have said was, go to the criminal court and file a complaint. What they said was, you have to stop displeasing him. Go back home and redouble your efforts to please him. Because the Quran sanctions the beating of a woman from whom you fear disobedience. So, the Sharia courts are operating at variance with the courts that enforce the law of the land. One absolute imperative that we have to safeguard in Canada, in the United States, in the UK, everywhere in the West, if we're going to survive this thing, is that we have to insist on one law for all people. And there are no groups that have special laws that supersede the law of the land. Now, a lot of Jewish and Christian groups oppose me saying that, and they say, you see, you racist, bigoted, hate monger, in your zeal to oppress Muslims, you are going to get rid of our own Jewish courts and Catholic canon law courts. Well, that's actually not the case, because those courts do not conflict with the law of the land. And where Sharia courts assert a law that is radically at variance with Canadian law, or American law, or British law, they should not be allowed to operate. It ought to be common sense. Actually, one of the foremost achievements of Western society, and the civilization of which we are all children and heirs, is the idea that we are all subject to the same law. That there aren't elite classes that are exempt from various laws that the rest of us common folk have to deal with. But we all have the same laws. Now that principle is being lost. And Muslims are being set up as an elite class with special laws. This cannot end well and will not end well. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering what you thought of Donald Trump. Like, do you think if he gets in, will he change things? Or I have a brother that lives in Boston, and he thinks he's going to change a lot of things.
Well, I can tell you, what do I think of Donald Trump is the question, and will he change things? There's no doubt if he becomes president, he'll change things. Now, for the better or not,
Yeah.
I'll tell you about Donald Trump. I am very ambivalent about Donald Trump for a variety of reasons. One is he's wildly popular among certain people in the US because he's not a politician and he's not one of these packaged, processed, lying hypocrites that have been ruling us for so long. He's a real guy, and people love that. They're tired of these people reading off their pre-planned talking points, and they love that he actually speaks. And he doesn't read like Barack Obama from his teleprompter, but he actually talks. He's a real guy. Beautiful. I love that myself. I don't love that he's sort of a boor and a blowhard and sort of a creep, and you know, he seems like kind of at the same time as a breath of fresh air in American politics, a sign of the degeneration of American politics at the same time, in the same way. And so I don't know what to make of that. Now substantively, I also am equally ambivalent. In the first place, he aroused tremendous anger by saying that there needs to be a temporary moratorium on Muslim immigration. Now, people said, Trump is like Hitler because he wants a temporary moratorium on Muslim immigration. Now think about that. Hitler refused to allow Jews to emigrate from Germany so he could kill them. Trump wants to refuse to allow Muslims to immigrate into the United States so that they won't kill us. And that's the same. It's ridiculous. All the people who are calling Trump Hitler, nary a single person addressed the actual problem, that there is no way to distinguish jihadis from peaceful Muslims. The Islamic State says, when you go to the West, don't wear a beard, don't carry a Quran, you'll arouse suspicion. Shave your beard, don't go to mosque, act like you're an ordinary guy, Because they're looking for devout people. They figure that the devout people are the ones who are going to do this. Which actually they're not looking for. They think devout Muslims are just wonderful and going to contribute to our glorious multicultural mosaic. But this is what the Islamic State says. So they tell them to blend in. So how are you going to tell if a Muslim is a jihadi or not when they tell them don't have any distinguishing characteristics? Tashfeen Malik, the San Bernardino shooter who killed 14 people at a Christmas party on December 2nd, she had passed 5 separate background checks from 5 different US agencies. How did she do that? She had no criminal record. That's how. The only thing they can check for is criminal records. The Islamic State recruits people who don't have criminal records for precisely that reason. So how are you going to keep the jihadis from coming in among peaceful refugees? You can't do it. And nobody ever addressed that. Nobody said, well, Mr. Trump, we do have to keep the jihadis out, and that's what your proposal is for, but here's how we can do it in another way. There is no way to do it in another way. He offered the only solution to it. And for that, he was called Hitler. At the same time, on the downside, I believe very strongly in the freedom of speech. The freedom of speech is the foremost aspect of a free society. If you cannot rebuke the tyrant can work his will unopposed. You have to be able to speak out. Now, the freedom of speech is under serious attack by Muslims. Most notably, it drives them crazy when people draw Muhammad. If I were to take a piece of paper, a pen, and draw on this paper towel right now some guy with a beard and say, that's Muhammad, then Muslims would want to kill me. It's that ridiculous, but that's the way it is. And they did kill the cartoonists who drew Muhammad in the Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris in January 2015. And so, after that, Pamela Geller and I had an event in Texas last May, coming up to a year. It was May 3rd. And we had a Muhammad art exhibit and cartoon contest. It was designed to show that we will not be intimidated. We will not be bullied. We will not submit. We are going to stand for the freedom of speech and free society. And if they're telling us they're going to kill us for drawing Muhammad, then we have to draw Muhammad, because there are only 2 choices. If they tell us they're going to kill us for drawing Muhammad, then we can either draw Muhammad and thereby show that we will not submit to this bullying, or not draw Muhammad and thereby show that they can get us to do what they want by threatening to kill us. And then they'll just make more threats and get us to do more of what they want. So it only encourages more bullying and more violence. So we had to stand. We had our event and jihadis attacked it, but we had tremendous security there, and the jihadis were killed, and that was the end of the story, except it wasn't. Then, Pamela Geller, we were both organizers of the event, but the media fastened on her. She is far more attractive, and they blamed her for this. They said she provoked them. And Donald Trump said she is a terrible spokesperson for the freedom of speech, and what are they doing drawing Muhammad? Couldn't they draw something else? We weren't there to draw. We were there to show that free people will not be bullied into silence. Donald Trump should have understood that, but he did not. He showed by his comments that he doesn't have any genuine understanding of the importance of the freedom of speech or how it's threatened. And that's very disquieting. Of course, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, they're direct enemies of the freedom of speech and have worked in many ways to shut it down. So Donald Trump is maybe marginally better than that, but still not so hot. So he's a very mixed bag, and we'll see if by some chance he becomes president, but I do have to tell you, I don't think he will become president. I could be wrong. I'm not a prognosticator, but this election is reminding me of 1912. You may recall, if you have studied American history, the election of 1912, I remember it very well. And in 1896, 1900, 1904, and 1908, the Republicans had won a comfortable majority. And that majority still existed in 1912. But in 1908, Theodore Roosevelt had been president for 8 years, and he retired. He didn't have to in those days. It's the law now, but he could have served more than 8 years in those days. But he retired. And he handpicked his successor, William Howard Taft. Taft became president. Theodore Roosevelt went hunting, everybody was happy. But Theodore Roosevelt got bored and restless. And he thought, you know, it was kind of exciting to be president. And he went back and he said to Taft, I am going to be president again, so I need you to retire in 1912. And Taft said, no, thank you. I'm actually enjoying this myself. And so the Republican Party was split. It still had a comfortable majority. If you take the votes that Taft got and Roosevelt got and put them together, the one candidate would have very soundly defeated Woodrow Wilson. But Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate, who actually got fewer votes than William Jennings Bryan, the perennial loser, got in 1908, he became president, and he was a disaster. One of the worst presidents we've ever had. He started us out, actually, on a lot of the bad roads that we're still following in terms of misguided misadventures in other countries. And anyway, it's a long story that we are not here to discuss. But the point is, the majority party was split, and the minority party won. And nowadays, it's the same thing. There are these people who will say, who are Republicans, who say, never Trump. They'll sooner vote for Hillary than for Trump. And so they're going to split. If Trump is the nominee, then there will be another Republican candidate running for president. And that guarantees that Hillary Clinton will be the next president of the United States. And then we're all in very big trouble. As if we weren't already.
Next question.
Robert.